The rain in Paris was not gentle, it was an insistent, cold curtain that usually drove people indoors, but Alara did not notice. She was standing before a canvas that was barely visible behind a velvet rope, its subject a chaotic swirl of sapphire blues and corrosive golds. Alara Vance, at 29, was the youngest chief curator the Musée d'Orsay had ever appointed, a title that came with the expectation of impeccable control. Yet, her control fractured slightly whenever she stood before Aurelian's Comet, a painting whose provenance was as murky as its artist's fate. The painting was scheduled to be the centerpiece of the museum's winter exhibition, and Alara had staked her reputation on it. She ran a gloved finger along the cool metal barrier, her mind sifting through historical documents, police reports from the 1920s, and contradictory auction notes. Aurelian's Comet was mesmerizing, a canvas where light seemed to be actively fighting the shadows. But the story whispered through the hushed halls of the art world was that the man who painted it, a forgotten modernist named Julian Vance, no known relation, though Alara had secretly hoped, had disappeared the night it was completed. A beautiful tragedy, isn't it? A voice, rich and unexpected, cut through the silence of the late hour. Alara spun around, her posture immediately snapping back to the professional steel she usually maintained. Standing a respectful distance away was a man she did not recognize. He was tall, dressed in an impeccably tailored but slightly disheveled dark suit, and held a slim, antique sketchpad under one arm. His eyes, a startling shade of deep moss green, held a casual, unnerving intensity. He shouldn't have been there. The museum had been closed for over an hour. "I'm sorry, sir," Alara said, her tone clipped and authoritative. "The museum is closed. I must ask how you gained entry." A slow, wry smile touched his lips, a smile that suggested a universe of secrets and a charming disregard for rules. "Forgive me. I have an affiliation with the Acquisitions Committee. My name is Alexander Thorne." He gestured vaguely toward the painting. "And to answer your question about its tragedy, the beauty is in the chaos, but the tragedy is that the painter never knew how intensely he loved before he vanished. It's all right there, in the rush of the comet's tail." Alara's carefully constructed intellectual walls stumbled. No one, not the critics, not the historians, had ever interpreted the painting as an expression of love, only of existential despair. "That's a very subjective interpretation, Mr. Thorne. The documentation points to isolation and genius." Alexander took a silent step closer to the barrier, his gaze never leaving the turbulent blues and golds. "Documentation only shows you the frame, Curator Vance. The painting shows you the heart. He wasn't isolated. He was desperately, blindingly in love. And I'm afraid that desperate love is the most dangerous kind." He finally turned his intense gaze back to Alara, and the sheer magnetic force of his presence seemed to pull the oxygen from the air. "I've come to Paris for this painting. And perhaps, for a conversation with the one person who truly sees it." The hair on the back of Alara's neck prickled. His casual mention of seeing the painting, not just looking at it, felt like a direct invasion of her private passion. A fierce, unfamiliar spark, half suspicion, half intrigue, ignited within her. "My security team will escort you out, Mr. Thorne," she stated, reaching for the phone in her pocket, but her hand hesitated. She wanted to know how he knew. She wanted to know what he saw. Alexander simply watched her, his unsettling green eyes holding hers in a perfect, still balance. "Before you do," he said softly, leaning in just enough for his voice to become a conspiratorial whisper, "did you know that Julian Vance signed the canvas not with his initials, but with the coordinates of the first place he ever kissed his muse?" Alara froze. The coordinates were indeed faintly scrawled in the lower right corner, information known only to the smallest circle of restoration experts. This man was not just an acquaintance of the acquisitions committee. He was something far more dangerous, and suddenly, far more interesting. "Who are you, really?" she whispered, dropping her hand from the phone. Alexander smiled, a genuine, captivating flash of light in the dim gallery. "Someone who needs your help, Alara. And someone who recognizes a kindred spirit standing in the middle of a beautiful tragedy." The silence of the Musée d'Orsay felt heavier after Alexander's revelation. Alara felt a pulse of adrenaline that had nothing to do with museum protocols and everything to do with the man standing inches away from her. The coordinates he mentioned were a secret she had guarded like a crown jewel, a detail suppressed from every official catalogue to prevent treasure hunters from desecrating the artist's history. "You shouldn't know that," Alara said, her voice dropping to a sharp whisper. "That information is under a non-disclosure agreement within the restoration department. If you've bribed my staff, Mr. Thorne—" "I didn't have to bribe anyone," Alexander interrupted gently, his voice smooth as aged whiskey. "I have the original letters Julian wrote while he was painting that masterpiece. He didn't just paint his soul onto that canvas. He wrote his heart into the margins of his life. Letters that have been in my family's possession for nearly a century." He took a step back, sensing her defensive wall rising, and held up his hands in a gesture of peace. "I'm not a thief, Alara. I'm a restorer of legacies. And right now, Julian Vance's legacy is under threat. There is a reason this painting was lost for 70 years, and there is a reason it has resurfaced now, just as you were appointed." Alara's mind raced. She had spent months researching the painting's sudden reappearance in a private collection in Geneva. The owner had been anonymous, the transaction handled by a fleet of lawyers. "What kind of threat?" she asked, her curiosity finally overriding her caution. Alexander looked around the shadows of the gallery, his expression darkening. "The man who sold this to the museum, he didn't own it. He stole it from a history that doesn't want to be found. And he didn't sell it for the money. He sold it as a lure." Before Alara could press him further, the heavy rhythmic thud of security boots echoed from the hallway. The night guard's flashlight beam danced across the far wall, heading toward the Impressionist wing. "If they find me here, I'll be banned, and you'll be questioned," Alexander said, his gaze locking onto hers with a sudden, urgent intensity. "And if that happens, the truth about the comet dies with Julian's letters. Meet me tomorrow morning. Les Deux Maggots, 8 o'clock. Bring the infrared scans of the bottom left corner. Not the ones you filed with the museum, the ones you kept for yourself." Alara gasped. How did he know about her private scans? She had discovered a ghostly layer beneath the paint, a hidden portrait that she hadn't yet dared to report, fearing it might delay the exhibition. 8 o'clock, Alara, he repeated, his voice barely a breath. "Don't let the shadows win this time." With a fluidity that suggested he was well acquainted with avoiding detection, Alexander vanished behind a marble pillar just as the guard turned the corner. "Mademoiselle Vance?" the guard called out, his light falling on Alara. "Is everything all right? I thought I heard voices." Alara stood alone before the swirling blues and golds of the comet, her heart hammering against her ribs. She looked at the spot where Alexander had stood, then back at the painting. For the first time, the comet didn't look like a falling star. It looked like a message. "Everything is fine, Jean," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "I was just saying good night to an old friend." But as she walked toward the exit, the weight of the secret infrared scans in her bag felt like lead. She was a woman of logic, of history, of cold facts. Yet, as she stepped out into the Parisian rain, she knew she wouldn't be calling security. She would be at the cafe at 8 o'clock, stepping into a world where the lines between art, history, and a dangerous romance were beginning to blur. The morning air at Les Deux Magots was thick with the scent of roasted coffee and damp pavement. Alara sat at a small round table, her fingers tracing the edge of a manila envelope. She hadn't slept. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the moss-green intensity of Alexander's gaze and the turbulent gold of the painting. She felt like a conspirator in her own life, a feeling that was both terrifying and electrifying. Exactly at 8, Alexander appeared. He wasn't wearing the suit from the night before. Instead, he wore a dark charcoal sweater and a leather jacket that looked like it had seen the dusty roads of half a dozen countries. He slid into the wicker chair opposite her without a word, his presence immediately shrinking the crowded terrace until it was just the two of them. "You came," he said, his voice a low hum against the morning bustle. "I wasn't sure if your loyalty to the museum would outweigh your curiosity." "My loyalty is to the truth of the art," Alara countered, pushing the envelope across the table. "And curiosity is just a polite word for what I'm feeling right now." "I want answers, Alexander. How do you know about my private scans? And what exactly is in those letters?" Alexander didn't open the envelope immediately. He looked at her, his expression softening into something more genuine, less guarded. "My family has searched for that painting for 3 generations. Not for its value, but for what it hides." Julian Vance wasn't just a painter. He was a man who stumbled upon a secret that people in 1927 were willing to kill for. "My great-grandfather was his only friend. He was the one Julian sent his final letters to before he vanished." He leaned in closer, his scent, sandalwood and cold rain, drifting toward her. "The infrared scans you have. You saw the woman's face, didn't you? The one hidden beneath the comet's tail." Alara felt a chill that had nothing to do with the Parisian breeze. "Yes. A woman looking over her shoulder, looking terrified. It's not a sketch, it's a fully realized portrait that he painted over in a frenzy." "That woman was Sophie de Roland," Alexander whispered. "The daughter of a man who controlled the French underworld. Julian loved her, and he tried to spirit her away. Aurelian's comet isn't just a painting, it's a map. Julian knew they were coming for him, so he hid the location of where he sent Sophie. And the inheritance she stole from her father. Inside the layers of that canvas." Alara's breath hitched. This was no longer just an art history mystery. This was a legacy of blood and devotion. "You're saying the painting is a map to a hidden treasure? That sounds like a fever dream, Alexander. Not a treasure of gold and jewels, Alara. A treasure of truth. Evidence that would have dismantled a criminal empire." Alexander reached out, his hand hovering near hers on the table. "The people who sold that painting to the Orsay are the descendants of those who wanted Sophie dead. They couldn't find the secret themselves, so they put it on a world stage, waiting for a brilliant curator like you to do the work for them. To scan it, to analyze it, to find what they missed." Alara looked down at his hand, then at the envelope. She realized with a jolt of fear that she was the key to a century-old hunt. "If they are watching the painting, they are watching me." "They are," Alexander confirmed, his voice turning grim. "Which is why we have to leave Paris. Tonight." The word, "leave," echoed in Alara's mind like a dissonant note in a symphony. She was a woman of schedules, of climate-controlled rooms and digital archives. The idea of fleeing Paris with a man she had met only twice was absurd, and yet, as she looked into Alexander's urgent, moss-green eyes, the sterile walls of the museum felt more like a cage than a sanctuary. "I can't just leave," Alara whispered, though her hand was already tightening around her bag. "I have a board meeting tomorrow. I have a life. You have a target on your back," Alexander corrected, his voice low and steady. "The moment you pulled those infrared scans, you stepped out of the role of a curator and into the role of a witness." Look behind you, Alara. Not quickly. The man at the corner kiosk with the gray cap. Alara adjusted her scarf, catching a glimpse in the reflection of the cafe window. A man stood there, ostensibly reading a newspaper, but his gaze was fixed squarely on their table. He was unnervingly still. He's been there since I sat down, Alexander said. We don't have time for the board meeting. If Julian's letters are correct, the map in the painting points to a small coastal villa in Normandy, a place called Le Havre de Paix. It's where Sophie was supposed to wait for him. It's where the evidence is buried. Before she could argue, Alexander stood up and tossed a few euros on the table. He didn't offer his hand, he simply began to walk, confident she would follow. Alara took a deep breath, the scent of the morning rain sharpening her senses, and stood up. She followed him through the winding streets of the left bank, her heart thumping against her ribs like a trapped bird. They reached the Gare Saint-Lazare just as the sun began to hide behind a fresh layer of charcoal clouds. The station was a whirlwind of motion, a sea of commuters that offered a temporary shroud. Alexander bought 2 tickets for a regional train, paying in cash. As they boarded the cramped, vibrating carriage of the train, the reality of the situation crashed down on Alara. She was sitting in a worn velvet seat, watching the Parisian suburbs blur into a smudge of gray and green. Why me? She asked suddenly, turning to him. You could have stolen those scans. You could have followed the map alone. Why involve me? Alexander leaned his head back against the seat, looking at her with an expression that was suddenly weary and devastatingly honest. Because I can read the letters, Alara, but I can't read the art. Julian wrote in code, a language of brushstrokes and pigment densities. I spent 10 years trying to crack it. Then I saw your thesis on the subliminal geometry of modernism, and I realized you were the only person in the world who could actually navigate the map he drew. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a small, weathered piece of parchment. It was a letter, the ink faded to a ghostly brown. He handed it to her. My dearest Alexander, it began, addressed to his great-grandfather. The comet carries the light, but the shadow of the tail points to the truth. Only one who understands the weight of the blue can find the way home. Alara's fingers brushed the paper, and for a moment, she felt a profound connection to the vanished painter. The weight of the blue, she murmured. He's talking about the ultramarine pigment. It's the densest part of the painting. Exactly, Alexander said, his voice dropping to a soft, intimate register. He reached out, his thumb grazing the back of her hand. It was a brief, electric touch that sent a jolt of heat through her. We're in this together now, Alara. For the art, for the truth, and maybe for Julian. The train let out a long, mournful whistle as it sped toward the coast. Alara looked out the window and saw the man in the gray cap standing on the platform they had just left. He wasn't boarding a train. He was speaking into a radio, his eyes fixed on their disappearing carriage. The train journey to Normandy felt like a descent into another century. As the urban sprawl of Paris faded, replaced by rugged cliffs and the salty tang of the Atlantic, Alara felt the thin thread of her old life finally snap. She was no longer a curator, she was a fugitive. They arrived in Dieppe under a bruised purple sky. The wind here was fierce, smelling of brine and ancient secrets. Alexander led her to a battered dark SUV hidden in the shadows of a local shipyard. How many more friends do you have waiting with cars in every port? Alara asked, her voice trembling slightly from the cold and the sheer absurdity of the situation. Fewer than I used to, Alexander replied grimly, his eyes scanning the perimeter before he opened the door for her. The art world is a small place, Alara. But the world of stolen legacies is even smaller. They drove in silence for nearly an hour, navigating narrow, winding roads that hugged the coastline. Finally, the headlights caught the silhouette of a structure perched precariously on a jagged cliff. Le Havre de Paix. It wasn't a villa in the traditional sense. It was a stone lighthouse cottage, weathered by 100 years of storms, its windows like hollow eyes staring out at the sea. Inside, the air was thick with dust and the ghostly scent of turpentine. Alexander lit a kerosene lamp, and the amber glow danced across the walls. He didn't waste time. He moved to a heavy oak table and spread out the letters. "The painting, Alara," he whispered, gesturing to the manila envelope she still gripped. "Look at the scans again. Not at the woman, but at the light around her." Alara laid out the infrared images. In the harsh, flickering light of the lamp, the hidden layers of Aurelian's comet took on a new life. "The ultramarine," she murmured, her professional instincts kicking in. "It's not just dense. It's layered in a specific frequency." Julian didn't just use a brush. He used a palette knife to create ridges. She took out a magnifying glass, her face inches from the print. "Alexander, these aren't just ridges. They're a topographical match. The comet's tail isn't a celestial event. It's the coastline of this very cliff." Alexander stepped behind her, his chest almost brushing her shoulder. The heat radiating from him was a stark contrast to the drafty room. "And the woman? Sophie? Where is she looking?" Alara traced the line of sight of the hidden portrait. The woman beneath the paint was looking toward the fireplace, a massive, soot-stained stone hearth that dominated the room. Suddenly, a heavy thud echoed from the floorboards above. Alexander froze, his hand instinctively reaching for Alara's waist to pull her back. "We aren't alone," he breathed into her ear, his voice barely a ghost of a sound. The front door, which Alexander had locked, didn't creak open. Instead, the large stained glass window in the kitchen shattered inward. A flashbang grenade skittered across the floor, and for a second, the world turned into blinding white light and a roar of static. Through the ringing in her ears, Alara felt Alexander's strong arms wrap around her, shielding her body with his own as they dove behind the heavy oak table. "Give us the scans, Mr. Thorne," a voice shouted from the darkness, a voice as cold and mechanical as a gunshot. "The curator is a collateral expense we'd rather not pay for, but we will if we must." The world was a chaotic blur of smoke and jagged shadows. The heavy oak table was the only thing standing between them and the men in the darkness. Alara's heart pounded so hard she could feel it in her fingertips. Alexander's grip on her was firm, his body a solid shield against the impending threat. "Stay low," Alexander commanded, his voice a low, urgent rasp. "And whatever happens, do not let go of that envelope." Another flashlight beam cut through the smoke, scanning the room with lethal precision. "We know the secret is in the layering, Thorne," the voice called out again. It was the man in the gray cap from the station, his French accent now sharp and menacing. "The girl has done the work for us. Hand over the scans, and she walks away. Otherwise, this lighthouse becomes your tomb." Alexander looked at Alara. In the dim, flickering light of the dying kerosene lamp, his eyes weren't just determined, they were filled with a fierce, protective light that made her breath catch. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a small, heavy object, not a gun, but a flare. "Alara, listen to me," he whispered, his face inches from hers. "On the count of 3, I'm going to create a distraction. You need to crawl to the hearth. Remember where Sophie was looking? The third stone from the left, at eye level. Push it." "What about you?" she asked, her voice trembling. "I'll be right behind you. Now, 1, 2, 3. Alexander stood up and ignited the flare, hurling it toward the shattered kitchen window. The room erupted in a blinding crimson glare, momentarily disorienting their attackers. Gunshots rang out, sharp, deafening cracks that splintered the wood of the table, but Alara was already moving. She scrambled across the dusty floorboards, the smell of gunpowder and salt air filling her lungs. She reached the massive stone fireplace just as a shadow loomed over her. She didn't look back. She found the third stone, her fingers frantically searching for a seam. It felt cold and immovable, but she threw her entire weight against it. With a grinding sound of stone on stone, a small compartment swung inward. Inside sat a rusted metal box, sealed with wax. "I have it," she cried out. At that moment, a hand grabbed her shoulder, spinning her around. It was the man in the gray cap. His face was a mask of cold fury, a jagged scar running down his cheek. He raised his weapon, but before he could fire, Alexander tackled him with the force of a tidal wave. The two men crashed into the furniture, a desperate struggle of limbs and heavy breaths. "Run, Alara! To the cliff path!" Alexander shouted as he pinned the attacker's arm. Alara hesitated for a split second, looking at the man who was risking everything for a legacy that wasn't even his. But she saw the determination in his eyes and understood. She grabbed the metal box and the envelope, then dived through the side door into the howling night. The wind nearly knocked her off her feet. The rain was a torrential downpour now, and the sound of the Atlantic crashing against the rocks below was like a roar of 1,000 beasts. She scrambled onto the narrow path, her boots slipping on the mud. Behind her, the lighthouse erupted in a different kind of light. A fire had started, the orange flames licking the windows, casting long, dancing shadows across the cliffs. "Alexander!" She screamed into the wind, but the only answer was the crash of the waves. The salt spray stung Alara's eyes as she crouched behind a jagged outcrop of rock. The lighthouse was now a beacon of fire against the black Normandy sky. She clutched the rusted metal box to her chest, its cold surface biting into her skin. Her mind screamed at her to keep running, to disappear into the darkness of the coastal path, but her heart was anchored to the burning building. "Please," she whispered into the gale. "Please, Alexander." Just as the heat from the fire began to crack the upper windows of the cottage, a silhouette leapt from the side porch. It was Alexander. He hit the muddy ground hard, rolling down the embankment before catching himself on a gnarled pine root. Behind him, the man in the gray cap emerged, staggering and clutching his side, but still raising his weapon. A shot rang out, muffled by the roar of the ocean. The bullet struck the stone inches from Alara's head, showering her in grit. "Alara! Down!" Alexander's voice was a raw command. He lunged toward her, his movements fueled by pure adrenaline. He grabbed her hand, his grip bruisingly tight, and pulled her toward a narrow crevice in the cliffside that she hadn't seen, a hidden path used by smugglers centuries ago. They slid down a steep, treacherous slope of loose shale, the darkness swallowing them as they descended toward the base of the cliffs. Above them, the orange glow of the fire flickered and then faded as they entered a natural sea cave. The silence inside the cave was deafening, broken only by the rhythmic, heavy thrum of the tide. Alexander collapsed against the damp limestone wall, his chest heaving. In the faint moonlight reflecting off the water at the cave's mouth, Alara saw the dark stain spreading across his shoulder. "You're hurt," she gasped, dropping the box and reaching for him. "I've had worse," he managed, a grimace of pain flickering across his features. "But we've got what we came for." He looked at the rusted box in the sand. Julian's final secret. The reason he never made it to Sophie. Alara's hands trembled as she tore a strip from her silk scarf to staunch the bleeding on his shoulder. Her professional composure had completely evaporated, replaced by a raw, terrifying intimacy. As she worked, she felt Alexander's gaze on her. Not the calculating gaze of a man on a mission, but something softer, more vulnerable. "You could have died back there," she said, her voice breaking. "Why didn't you just give them the scans?" Alexander reached up with his good hand, his fingers tracing the line of her jaw, tilting her face so she had to look at him. "Because some things are worth more than safety, Alara. Julian knew that. He died for a love that was written in the stars and hidden in the paint. And I." He paused, his thumb brushing her lower lip. "I couldn't let them take that away from you. Not when you're the only one who truly understands the beauty of it." The air between them changed, vibrating with a tension that was more dangerous than the men hunting them. In the belly of a cold cave, surrounded by shadows and the scent of the sea, the distance between the curator and the stranger vanished. Alara leaned in, her forehead resting against his. "We have to open it," she whispered. "We have to know if it was worth it." Alexander nodded, his hand sliding to the rusted latch of the box. With a sharp tug, the wax seal snapped, and the lid creaked open. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, was a single, heavy object and a bundle of letters tied with a blue velvet ribbon, the same blue as the comet's tail. The cave was silent, save for the rhythmic lap of the tide against the rocks. Alexander's breathing was shallow, his face pale in the silver moonlight, but his hands were steady as he carefully unwrapped the oilcloth. Inside, beneath the bundle of letters, lay a heavy, ornate brass cylinder, a sea captain's map case from the 19th century, engraved with the initials SR. "Sophie Roland," Alara whispered, her fingers grazing the cool metal. This was hers. Alexander untied the blue velvet ribbon. The letters were not from Julian to Sophie, but from Sophie to Julian. As Alara scanned the first few lines, the true scale of the tragedy unfolded. Sophie hadn't been a passive muse, she was an architect of her own escape. She had discovered that her father, a man of immense power and darker secrets, was laundering money through the very art galleries Julian frequented. "She didn't just steal an inheritance," Alara murmured, her eyes widening as she read. "She stole the ledger. The names of every corrupt official in the French government from 1925. She hid the ledger inside a second, larger canvas, a twin to Aurelian's comet, and sent it to a secure vault in Switzerland. This cylinder, it's the key." Alexander let out a dry, pained laugh. "So the painting in the Orsay isn't the treasure. It's the instruction manual. Julian painted the coordinates and the method to open this case into the comet, knowing only someone with an artist's soul and a scientist's precision could decode it." He looked at Alara, his expression a mix of admiration and regret. "The men chasing us aren't just art thieves. They are the descendants of the men named in that ledger. They've spent 80 years trying to erase the evidence Sophie and Julian tried to bring to light. If they get this cylinder, the truth stays buried forever." The intimacy of the cave suddenly felt fragile. The weight of the secret they held was enough to crush them both. Alexander leaned back, his strength visibly waning from the blood loss. "Alara," he said softly, his voice barely audible over the waves. "You have to take it. I'm slowing you down. There's a fisherman's path 3 miles north. It leads to a village where I have another contact. You take the cylinder and the letters. You finish what Julian started." "No," Alara said, her voice firm, surprising even herself. She gripped his hand, her fingers interlacing with his. "I spent my life looking at history through a glass case, Alexander. I'm not letting you become another ghost and a footnote. We're leaving together." In that moment, the professional distance she had maintained for years didn't just crack, it shattered. She leaned forward, her lips meeting his in a kiss that tasted of salt, copper, and a desperate, burgeoning hope. It was a kiss that defied the darkness of the cave and the men hunting them on the cliffs above. But the moment was shattered by a sharp, metallic clink from the cave's entrance. A small, black cylinder, a tactical microphone, had been lowered from the crevice above. "They found us," Alexander hissed, his body tensing despite his injury. "They didn't follow the path. They're coming down the cliff face." The sound of the tactical microphone clinking against the limestone echoed like a death knell. They were trapped between the rising tide and a team of professional mercenaries descending from the sky. The cave, which had felt like a sanctuary only moments ago, was now a tomb. "The water," Alexander whispered, his eyes darting to the back of the cave where the shadows were deepest. Julian's letters mentioned a breath of the sea behind the altar of stone. He wasn't talking about poetry, Alara. He was talking about a blowhole. Alara looked where he was pointing. At the very back of the cavern, the tide was swirling violently around a narrow, vertical fissure. The sound of the waves there was different, a hollow, sucking whistle that indicated a passage to the surface, or at least to another chamber. "We can't swim through that, Alexander. You're losing blood, and the current is too strong," Alara cried, even as she heard the first repelling rope snap taut at the cave's mouth. "It's the only way," he said, pulling her close. He shoved the brass cylinder and the letters into a waterproof dry bag he had pulled from his jacket. He strapped it tightly to her chest. "The tide is coming in. If we stay, they kill us. If we go into the fissure, the pressure of the rising water will push us up. There's a sea stack on the other side of this cliff. If we can reach it, we can hide until dawn." A flashlight beam cut through the darkness of the cave entrance. Movement. A voice barked. "Sector 4. Fire at will." Bullets hissed into the water, sending up tiny plumes of white spray. Alexander didn't hesitate. He grabbed Alara's hand, his grip a lifeline in the chaos. "Deep breath, Alara. Don't let go of me. Whatever you do, don't let go." They dove. The water was a paralyzing shock of ice. Alara's lungs screamed as the current seized them, dragging them into the narrow throat of the fissure. It was a world of absolute darkness and roaring pressure. She felt the rough stone scrape her shoulders, and for a terrifying second, she felt Alexander's hand slip. She lunged forward in the dark, her fingers catching the fabric of his sweater. She pulled him toward her with a strength born of pure terror. The water surged, a massive pulse of the Atlantic pushing them upward through the narrow chimney of rock. Just as her vision began to blur into gray, they erupted into the open air. They were gasping, shivering, and clinging to the side of a jagged sea stack 50 yards from the cliff face. Above them, the lighthouse was still burning, a crown of fire on the horizon. They could see the silhouettes of the mercenaries at the cave's mouth, looking like small, angry ants. We made it," Alara wheezed, her body shaking uncontrollably from the cold. Alexander was barely conscious, his head resting against the sharp barnacles of the rock. "The cylinder." He coughed. "Check the cylinder." Alara fumbled with the dry bag. She pulled out the brass case. In the moonlight, she noticed something she hadn't seen in the cave. The end of the cylinder wasn't a cap. It was a dial, marked with the same celestial symbols as the comet's tail in the painting. "It's a combination lock," she realized, her teeth chattering. "Alexander, I know the code. It's not numbers. It's the sequence of the stars Julian painted. He didn't just paint a comet, he painted a date." But as she looked up to tell him, she saw a dark shape silhouetted against the moon. A helicopter was banking low over the water, its searchlight sweeping the waves like the eye of a vengeful god. And it was heading straight for their rock. The deafening roar of the helicopter blades whipped the sea into a frenzy of white foam. The searchlight was a blinding white eye, scanning the jagged rocks with lethal intent. Alara pressed herself and the semi-conscious Alexander into a narrow cleft in the sea stack, the cold stone biting into her back. They were exposed, exhausted, and running out of time. "Alexander, stay with me," she whispered, her voice cracking. She could see his eyes fluttering, his skin ghostly pale under the artificial glare. She knew she had to do more than just hide. She had to solve the puzzle Julian Vance had left behind before they were captured or swept away by the rising tide. She pulled the brass cylinder from the waterproof bag. Her hands were numb, but her mind was racing with the images of Aurelian's comet. She visualized the painting, the way the gold leaf intersected with the deep ultramarine. It wasn't just art, it was a map of the sky from a specific night in 1927. "The stars," she murmured, her fingers finding the rotating rings on the cylinder. He didn't just paint the comet. He painted the alignment of Mars, Venus, and the North Star on the night he and Sophie were supposed to escape. She remembered the infrared scans. Beneath the top layer of paint, Julian had hidden 3 distinct symbols: a rose for Sophie, a compass for himself, and a comet for their shared destiny. She began to turn the dials. Click. The first ring lined up with the symbol of the rose. Click. The second ring settled on the compass. The helicopter was circling back, the beam of its searchlight inches away from their hiding spot. The wind from the rotors threatened to pull the cylinder from her wet hands. "One more," she breathed. The comet. The date of the eclipse. She turned the final dial to the coordinates she had memorized from the bottom right corner of the canvas. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then, with a soft, internal hiss of escaping air, the cylinder didn't just open, it unfolded. Inside was not a paper ledger, but a series of micro-photographs mounted on glass slides, a cutting-edge technology for the 1920s, and a small, tarnished silver key with a Swiss bank's insignia. "I have it," she whispered, tears of relief mingling with the salt spray on her face. "Alexander, I have the evidence. It's all here." But the victory was short-lived. The searchlight finally hit them, pinning them against the rock like specimens on a board. A voice boomed over a loudspeaker, amplified by the wind. "Mademoiselle Vance, drop the cylinder and step away from Mr. Thorne. There is nowhere left to run. If you cooperate, the museum will be told you were a victim of a kidnapping. If you do not, you will simply disappear into the Atlantic." Alexander stirred, his hand feebly gripping Alara's arm. "The water." He wheezed, looking not at the helicopter, but at the dark, swirling depths below them. "Alara. The tide. It's high enough now." Alara looked down. The surge of the ocean had filled the gaps between the rocks. Below them was a narrow, deep water channel that led away from the cliffs and toward the open sea, where the silhouettes of local fishing boats were beginning to appear on the horizon, heading out for the morning catch. "We have to jump," she realized. "On my mark," Alexander whispered, a ghost of his former strength returning to his voice. The helicopter began to lower a winch, a man in black tactical gear descending toward them. Alara tucked the glass slides and the key into her inner pocket, gripped Alexander's hand with everything she had, and looked him in the eyes. "Together," she said. The fall felt like it lasted a lifetime. For a few weightless seconds, the roar of the helicopter and the screams of the wind vanished, replaced by a terrifying, absolute silence. Then, the Atlantic hit them like a wall of concrete. The impact tore Alara's hand from Alexander's. The freezing water surged into her nose and mouth, a chaotic vortex of salt and darkness dragging her down. She kicked frantically, her heavy clothes pulling her toward the sandy floor, her heart screaming for oxygen. "Alexander!" Her mind cried out. She breached the surface, gasping for air, her lungs burning. The searchlight from the helicopter was still slicing through the spray, but it was focused on the sea stack they had just vacated. The pilot hadn't expected them to jump into the treacherous Devil's Throat channel. "Alexander," she choked out, her voice lost in the crash of the waves. A few yards away, a dark shape bobbed in the water. She swam toward it with a desperation she didn't know she possessed. It was him, floating face down. She grabbed his collar, hauling his head above the water. He was unconscious, his breathing ragged and wet. "Don't you dare leave me," she sobbed, kicking with all her might to keep them both afloat. The current in the channel was fierce, a conveyor belt of cold water carrying them away from the cliffs. Above, the helicopter began a systematic sweep of the surface. The beam of light moved closer, a white scythe cutting through the darkness. Alara spotted a piece of debris, a large, weathered wooden crate, likely washed off a cargo ship during the previous night's storm. With the last of her strength, she pushed Alexander toward it, draping his arms over the wood and clinging to the side herself. She tucked her head down, trying to minimize their silhouette. The searchlight passed over them, once, twice, the light turning the water around them into a terrifying, translucent emerald. The helicopter hovered for a moment, the downdraft creating a blizzard of salt spray. Then, miraculously, the engine note changed. The light moved away, heading back toward the shoreline. They had been dismissed as casualties of the fall. They drifted in the silence of the pre-dawn sea for what felt like hours. The cold was a physical weight, numbing Alara's limbs until she could no longer feel the wood beneath her fingers. She stayed awake by reciting the names of the pigments Julian Vance had used: ultramarine, burnt sienna, zinc white, ochre. As the first faint line of gray appeared on the eastern horizon, low, rhythmic thrumming began to vibrate through the water. It wasn't the sharp whine of a helicopter, but the steady, comforting heartbeat of a diesel engine. A small fishing trawler, the L'Étoile du Matin, emerged from the mist like a ghost ship. "Help!" Alara tried to scream, but her voice was a dry rattle. She reached into her pocket, pulled out the brass cylinder, and used its polished surface to catch the first rays of the rising sun, flashing a desperate signal toward the boat. A figure appeared at the railing of the trawler. A bell rang out across the water. As the boat pulled alongside them in rough, warm hands reached down to pull her from the icy grip of the ocean. Alara felt the silver key in her pocket. They were alive. But as she looked at Alexander's still, gray face being lifted onto the deck, she realized that the war for Julian's legacy had only just moved to a much more dangerous stage. The cabin of the L'Étoile du Matin smelled of diesel, dried salt, and old wool blankets. Alara sat hunched over a mug of bitter black coffee, her body shivering so violently the liquid splashed against her hands. Across the narrow cabin, a local doctor, a friend of the fisherman, was finishing a bandage on Alexander's shoulder. "He is strong," the doctor murmured in French, glancing at Alara. "The cold saved him by slowing the bleeding, but he needs a hospital, mademoiselle. And you look like you have seen the end of the world." "Not the end," Alara whispered, her fingers instinctively touching the silver key hidden beneath her damp sweater. "Just the beginning of a very old debt." By the time they reached a safe house in the countryside of Normandy, Alexander was conscious, though weak. They had no phones, no passports, and the museum would have surely reported Alara missing, or worse, implicated in the theft of the comet. They were ghosts in their own country. "The key," Alexander rasped, reaching out for her hand as they sat in the dim light of a hidden cellar. "The insignia. It's the Banque Privée de Genève, but the branch is in Zurich." Julian and Sophie didn't just hide the truth. They put it in the one place the French underworld couldn't reach in 1927. "But how do we get there?" Alara asked. "They'll be watching the airports, the trains." The man in the gray cap. "He saw my face. He knows I have the cylinder. Alexander gave a faint, defiant smile. We don't go as ourselves. My family didn't just keep letters, Alara. We kept connections. There are ways across the border that don't involve passports. But you have to be ready. Once we open that vault, there is no going back to the Musée d'Orsay. Alara looked at her reflection in a small, cracked mirror on the wall. Her hair was matted with salt, her eyes were shadowed with exhaustion, and the polished, professional curator she once was seemed like a stranger from a different life. She thought of the painting, of the hidden face of Sophie Roland, and the man who had died to protect a secret. The museum was a gallery of other people's lives, she said firmly. For the first time, I'm actually living mine. Let's go to Zurich. They traveled by night, moved by a network of art restorers and historians who owed Alexander's family old favors. They were hidden in the back of crates, driven through mountain passes, and walked across the Swiss border under the cover of a thick alpine fog. When they finally stood before the imposing, gray stone facade of the bank in Zurich, the air was crisp and biting. Alara felt a surge of adrenaline. This was the final piece of the puzzle. This was where the weight of the blue would finally be measured. As they entered the hushed, marble halls of the bank, Alara noticed a man in a dark suit standing by the elevators. He wasn't a bank employee. He had the same disciplined, predatory stillness as the men in the lighthouse. She leaned closer to Alexander, her voice a mere breath. Don't look now. At the elevators. They didn't just follow us, Alexander. They were already here, waiting. The lobby of the bank was a cathedral of silence, where the only sound was the rhythmic ticking of a grand clock and the soft scuff of leather shoes on marble. Alexander didn't flinch. He leaned heavily on his cane, his face a mask of aristocratic indifference, though Alara could feel the tension radiating from his hand on her arm. Walk with purpose, he whispered. In a place like this, hesitation is a confession. They approached the mahogany desk of the chief vault warden. Alara presented the silver key and the brass cylinder. When the warden saw the celestial symbols, his eyes flickered with a recognition that had clearly been passed down through generations of bankers. He didn't ask for passports. He simply bowed and gestured toward the heavy steel doors of the subterranean levels. As the elevator descended, Alara saw the man in the dark suit step in behind them. The air in the small space became electric. The vault is private, monsieur, the warden said smoothly, sensing the intruder. I am the legal representative of the Roland estate, the man replied, his voice a cold rasp. He turned his gaze to Alara, a thin, cruel smile playing on his lips. And I believe the curator is holding property that belongs to my client. Property that has caused quite a bit of mess in Paris. The elevator doors opened to a corridor of reinforced steel. Alexander stepped forward, blocking the man's path to Alara. The property belongs to whoever holds the key, and the soul to understand it. Your clients have neither. The warden led Alara and Alexander into a small, private viewing room and placed a heavy, dust-covered box on the table. Outside the glass partition, the man in the suit stood like a vulture, his hand hovering near his jacket, waiting for the moment they emerged with the contents. Alara's hands trembled as she inserted the silver key. With a heavy thunk, the lock turned. Inside the box was not just a ledger. It was a second canvas, the twin to Aurelian's comet that Alexander had mentioned. But where the first painting was a swirl of chaos, this one was a masterpiece of clarity. It depicted Sophie Roland not in fear, but in triumph, holding a lantern that illuminated a list of names and bank account numbers painted directly into the background of the scene. It's beautiful, Alara breathed. He didn't just hide the evidence, he turned the crime into art. But as she looked closer, she realized the ledger wasn't the only thing there. Tucked into the frame was a small, sealed envelope addressed to the one who sees the light in the blue. Alara, look, Alexander pointed to the bottom of the ledger. The dates weren't just from the 1920s. The accounts had been active for a century, funding the very people who were currently standing outside the door. If we walk out with this, they'll kill us before we reach the street, Alara realized. Then we don't walk out, Alexander said, his eyes gleaming with a sudden, reckless spark. He looked at the high-speed fiber optic terminal in the corner of the room, provided for modern clients to manage their assets. You're a curator, Alara. You know how to digitize a masterpiece. Let's show the world Julian's final exhibition, in real time. The viewing room felt like a high-tech fortress, but the air was thin with the scent of old canvas and impending danger. Outside the glass, the man in the dark suit was no longer hiding his intentions. He was on his phone, likely calling for reinforcements to seal every exit of the bank. We have minutes, Alara, Alexander said, his voice straining with the effort to stand. He gestured to the painting of the triumphant Sophie. The world thinks Julian Vance was a madman who disappeared. Show them he was a witness. Alara's fingers flew across the keyboard of the bank's terminal. As a curator, she had overseen the most advanced digital archiving projects in Europe. She knew how to bypass standard encryptions when the goal wasn't to steal, but to broadcast. She connected the high-resolution scanner in the room to the terminal. As the light passed over the second comet, the names, the dates, and the secret accounts were pulled from the paint and converted into cold, hard data. I'm not just sending this to the police, Alara whispered, her eyes glowing with a fierce light. I'm sending it to the Associated Press, Le Monde, and the Interpol Art Crime Division simultaneously. I'm tagging every major museum in the world. They wanted Julian's secret? Now they'll have to explain it to the entire planet. Wait, Alexander said, pointing to the small envelope she had found earlier. The letter. Read it. It's not part of the evidence. Alara carefully broke the wax seal. The handwriting was Julian's, the same elegant, desperate script from the letters in Normandy. To the one who follows the comet. Truth is a heavy burden, but love is the only thing that makes it weightless. If you are reading this, I have failed to reach Sophie, but our light has not gone out. The blue is not a color of sadness. It is the color of the horizon where we are waiting. Take the key, take the name, and find the house where the sun never sets. The house where the sun never sets, Alara repeated. A realization struck her. Alexander, it's not just a poetic phrase. It's a location. A villa in the south of Italy, the Villa del Sole. It's where my grandmother grew up. She always said her father was a painter of shadows who had to change his name to survive. The connection hit them both like a physical blow. Alara wasn't just a curator who happened to be brilliant, she was the legacy. She was a Vance by blood, the great-granddaughter of Julian and Sophie. Suddenly, the lights in the vault flickered and died. The hum of the air conditioning ceased. The man outside the glass tapped on the window with the barrel of a silenced pistol, his expression one of cold finality. The bank's security had been compromised. Upload complete, Alara said, the screen flashing a bright green scent. The glass of the viewing room shattered as the man kicked the door in. But as he stepped into the room, his phone began to chime, along with the phones of every guard in the hallway. The news was breaking. The names of their employers were scrolling across every news feed in the world. It's over, Alexander said, standing tall despite his wound. You can kill us, but you can't kill the light. The comet has landed. The man in the suit froze. The cacophony of alerts coming from his pocket was the sound of a century-old empire collapsing in seconds. He looked at Alara, then at the terminal screen, and finally at the gun in his hand. For the first time, his cold, calculated expression flickered with a human emotion, fear. The shadows he served had no use for a man who failed in the light of global scrutiny. He lowered his weapon, backed out of the room, and vanished into the chaos of the panicked bank lobby. Justice moved with the speed of the digital age. Within hours, the French government was in a state of emergency, and the descendants of the men who had haunted Julien and Sophie were being taken into custody across 3 continents. 1 month later, the air was warm and scented with lemon blossoms and sea salt. Alara stood on the terrace of the Villa del Sol, perched high above the shimmering turquoise of the Amalfi coast. In her hand, she held the original Aurelian's comet. The Musée d'Orsay had officially returned it to her, acknowledging her as the rightful heir to the Vance estate. Beside it sat the second painting, the portrait of Sophie Roland. For the first time in 90 years, the 2 halves of a single soul were back together. "You look different without the museum walls around you," a familiar voice said. Alara turned to see Alexander. He was no longer the disheveled, haunted man from the gallery. He looked healthy, his green eyes reflecting the brilliance of the Mediterranean sun. He still walked with a slight limp, a permanent reminder of their jump into the Atlantic, but his smile was full of a peace she hadn't seen before. "I feel different," Alara admitted, stepping toward him. "I spent my whole life protecting the past because I was afraid of the future. I thought art was something you study. I didn't realize it was something you live." Alexander reached out, his hand sliding into hers, his fingers interlacing with a familiarity that felt as old as time. "Julien and Sophie didn't just leave us a scandal, Alara. They left us a map to each other. They knew that truth alone isn't enough to survive. You need someone to share it with." They looked out at the horizon, where the deep ultramarine of the sea met the pale sapphire of the sky. Somewhere in that distance, the ghosts of the past were finally at rest. The comet was no longer a symbol of tragedy or a falling star, it was a bridge. "What happens now?" Alexander asked softly, pulling her closer. Alara leaned her head against his shoulder, watching the golden light of the setting sun wash over the villa. "Now," she whispered, "we stop looking for the light in the paint, and we start living in the light of the sun." The curator and the restorer stood together on the edge of a new world, a masterpiece of their own making, where the only colors that mattered were the ones they would choose to paint their future with. The story of Aurelian's comet had ended, but their story was only just beginning.